And thanks for waiting for us here on YouTube Live. We just finished day 3 of Sarah Hartsfield's murder trial here in Chambers County. A lot of medical testimony that got into court today that we listened to for several hours. We heard from 2 different doctors. We also heard from a nurse as well as a paramedic that responded to the scene when Joseph Hartsfield was found unresponsive. We also heard from the 911 dispatch supervisor. So a lot of testimony that got in. A big day in court once again. We do have our legal expert and a defense attorney not connected to this case, Rick DeToto. He's joining us live from the studio back in Houston. Rick, thanks so much for being with us once again.
Good to see you again. How you doing?
Good. Another long day, and I think, really some of the evidence, some of the questions that people have had about this case have really kind of started to come to light based on what we heard with the medical testimony today. I do want to mention, by the way, while we're here on YouTube, I think we have the live chat going, so if anyone has any questions while we're getting through this, please pop those in the chat and we can try to answer some of them at the end. But I do have a lot of questions for Rick, first of all, here. And Rick, I want to ask you because obviously, the attorneys on both sides, the prosecutor and the defense, they're looking at the medical records in this case. They're the same records. I mean, it's not like they have different sets of records that they are looking at. And we kind of saw a really different approach to both of them. So from the state, they're saying that Joseph Hartsfield always wanted his sugar level to be high. He didn't like to have a low sugar level, also known as hypoglycemia. He didn't like that, basically. And they say that there's no reason that he would have, injected himself with too much insulin because that was just a feeling that he did not like. We also then heard from the defense saying that Joseph Hartsfield never really followed the doctor's orders when it came to managing his diabetes. He had it for at least about 25 years, I think was the math that was roughly calculated. And so since he didn't manage it, the defense is trying to make the point that, well, if he wasn't keeping up with it the way that he should have been and listening to what the doctor said, well, then he could have ended up with some pretty severe complications from that. So, Rick, obviously, I don't know all the background of the jurors who are listening to this, but I think there are certain things that, of course, they're going to understand, and then there are other medical things that they just may not understand. So what of that evidence may be sticking for the jury as they hear some of this really in-depth, science-y and medicine-related testimony?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that we struggle with as lawyers, to take complicated medical information or expert testimony and break it down to be able to present it to a jury so they can understand it and follow our position in the case. I think there's 2 things that the lawyers have to do. Number one, they have to meet with their experts and talk with them and get to know them and their personality, and stress to them that they have to teach. They have to be teachers in the courtroom, and they have to act like the jury is in their first day of college going to, some type of medical class, and break it down in very simple terms and explain to them in very simple terms what they're trying to get across. Number 2, I think the experts following number 1 have to use diagrams. They have to have some sort of pictures or charts or something that the jury can put all the evidence together and kind of see it and see how it plays out. So I don't know if that exactly applies in this case, but it's very typical in the battle of the experts. There's 2 extreme sides. The prosecution says one thing, the defense says the other. And it's difficult to figure out what the jury decides. I think we have, as lawyers, have to make sure that they understand the information to start with, and then we kind of go from there.
And when we're talking about a case like this where there are so many discrepancies over what happened and there's really no clear understanding about exactly who injected that insulin because there was no one there and there was no surveillance video, it was just the couple in the house. I'm just curious, that has to make it kind of difficult when they're hearing both sides. You know what I'm saying? Like they're hearing from both the defense and the state, and the with so many confusing concepts, it just seems like it has to be something kind of hard for the jury to wrap their head around. Even I'm having a hard time sitting there and trying to process everything.
Yes, sir. And I think the best way to put it is discrepancies and no clear information equal reasonable doubt. It's that simple. The prosecution has the burden, they carry the burden, they have to prove to the jurors beyond a reasonable doubt what happened, and it sounds like they're not able to do that at this point. And you're expressing, I think, maybe what the jury might be thinking is they don't understand what's going on, what happened, did he take care of himself, did he not take care of himself, what the cause of death is, and that's exactly what we want to happen in terms of the jury finding the person not guilty in reasonable doubt. So I think what I'm trying to say is I think that plays in favor of the defense.
So we did see one of those charts and graphs that you mentioned from the state today. They brought in a big chart and basically showed what Joseph Hartsfield's glucose monitor showed as he was experiencing this really low blood sugar level. It appears that his blood sugar may have been dangerously low for about 20 hours, from 6 o'clock one evening all the way until around 2 o'clock the following afternoon, which is when apparently that 911 call was made, and medics then responded and he got rushed to the hospital. So there was a big chart for the jury to see and kind of monitor what his glucose level was doing. There's a question, though, about some alerts. And so for people who aren't familiar, there's what's called a Dexcom, which monitors. You can actually see some of the data there on the screen showing those graphs. The glucose monitor, it's a Dexcom, and it provides kind of some real-time monitoring data about a blood sugar level. And in this case, there's some question about if he would have been able to even hear those alerts when his sugar level was so dangerously low. And then also there's a question about if Sarah heard those alerts, because her defense attorneys claimed that she was actually recovering from her own surgery and on medication, and she wasn't able to, be of any help to Joe when he was dealing with this. She actually sent us a message from jail that I want to show. This was back in 2023. In that message to KPRC2, she said that she didn't ignore his Dexcom alerts. I was on my own pain regimen in another room after having another surgery. Joe knew I couldn't do anything for him. I was sleeping most of the day and night. My question here is what legal duty, if she did in fact hear and get those alerts, what legal duty might she have had to help him in that moment?
So the question, I believe, is, was she a caretaker of the deceased? Did she have a duty to, as you discussed, respond to those alerts and help him? I do not believe, it's just my opinion, that she was a caretaker in this case. She may have had a moral obligation to help him and try to take him to the hospital or administer medication or see what was going on. I don't think she had a legal duty under the definition of the law of a caretaker. Number two, her being under...
Well, let me just...
Go ahead.
One thing on that, when you're talking about the caretaker, because we did hear some testimony that she was actually pretty involved in his medical appointments and, actually called a doctor one time after he had been on a virtual appointment with her, with that doctor. And Sarah called the doctor. That doctor testified afterwards to kind of correct some of the information that Joseph had told the doctor. Does that make her a caretaker? Is she suddenly more involved, and does that add to her legal obligation?
I don't think it does, but I think that's a question the jury's gonna have to decide. I think it's a wife trying to help her husband with his medical issues, but I don't think under the legal definition in the state of Texas, and again, it's just my opinion, that she was a caretaker in terms of criminal responsibility at the time. Secondly, if she's under the influence of some pain medication or something that affects her ability to react or hear, or she's sleeping, that makes it even more complicated. So for example, you could be a caretaker, but if you just had surgery and you're taking a strong, sleeping medication or pain medication that affects your ability to respond to those alerts, that complicates it more, and it may take you out of culpability.
We did see actually some of her medical records in court today. Her defense attorney presented those, and it showed the medications that she had been prescribed, at least. But then kind of the caveat to that was that the state kind of said, well, we don't know for sure that she was taking those medications. Just because she was prescribed them, there's a question there. So that was one thing. There's still a lot of questions about these alerts and whether or not she acted as she, I guess, may have been obligated to, or if she even heard them. When showing some of this literal data from the medical devices, how effective do you think that is for a jury?
It's probably not very effective unless there's some clear explanation of the data. So just showing data points and complicated medical records and information from machines is very boring for juries, and they quickly tune out. You have to give them something to hold on to that they can understand. And again, that's where the diagrams come in. But even if the diagrams are too complicated, contain, legalese or medical terms that they don't understand, it's probably not that effective. And we see in trials a lot of times when the prosecutors are putting on complicated evidence with data points, you can see the jurors looking off into the hallway, kind of leaning back, rolling their eyes. So it's usually not effective unless you add to it and make it dynamic for them to hold on to something.
Yeah, just in watching, some of the jury's reactions to it, did seem like the medical information, maybe they were sighing at certain points or trying to really look in at their screen so they could see what exactly they were being presented. One question that we got from the YouTube live chat is why this trial is not being broadcasted live. And I'm sure as a defense attorney, you do have a lot of opinions about that. I will say, before all of this, KPRC 2 News and Dateline filed some documents with the court trying to get full access to live stream the trial, and the judge ultimately was the decider in this case, and he has agreed to have one camera shared among all the media outlets inside of the courtroom. He is not allowing any sort of audio recording, and that is not until the closing arguments as well as the verdict. And then if we get to the punishment phase, the judge has said that he may, reconsider those audio rules. Again, that's if we get to the punishment phase. What's your take, by the way, on live streaming a trial, especially with such interest as this? And I should mention, with alleged victims that are connected to her who don't live in this state that the state is trying to bring up during this.
Personally, I think it's great. I think it brings sunlight to the courtroom and the public gets to see everything. And it educates the public on the criminal justice process. But I think the concern that the court has is that in high-profile cases in general and when there's cameras around, people sometimes act different. So a witness may testify differently based on knowing that the information they testify to is going to be broadcast to the world and may affect their ability to testify effectively. So the court is concerned with the defendant having a fair trial and not letting cameras in the courtroom affect the demeanor or testimony of the witnesses. Again, I think it's great. I think it should be part of all the processes in the trials. But I understand the court's concern, and that's probably why the court limited the media's access in this case, just like they do in most cases.
One of the things that we've talked about throughout this, Rick, is the fact that there is no medical examiner's ruling here in this case. Of course, the cause has been determined as complications of toxic effects of insulin. That's how Joseph Hartsfield died. But the manner, which we should note is like homicide, suicide, accidental. I think there's a few very limited options for what the manner could be. One of the questions that Sarah's defense attorney asked today was if people commit suicide by insulin. And the doctor responded to that question saying that it wasn't really something that she had heard of. She guesses that it could be a possibility, but it did seem kind of extreme. How can the state prove that, a suicide is not what happened here?
They can't. They can't prove it, just like they can't prove the manner or means as to what happened. My concern with that question is that it kind of looks like you're throwing stuff against the wall to kind of see if it sticks. Maybe the defense lawyer is trying to give alternate reasons as to what happened and to show that the state further can't prove what actually happened. But I agree with you, it's a little bit extreme. When the notes you sent me and I read that, I was like, wow, that's an interesting question. It opens up a can of worms, but it may just be the defense lawyer trying to prove different ways this could have happened, and the state can't disprove it, thus reasonable doubt, thus not guilty.
That'll definitely be an interesting question because, again, the manner was left undetermined. But we are expecting the medical examiner who actually was involved in that autopsy. I actually saw her get sworn in inside the courtroom today, so we are expecting that she'll testify at some point here in the coming days. But I hear what you're saying about that. I want to know also, though, because the family testified yesterday, actually, and they said that, they believed that Sarah Hartsfield may have, been involved in some foul play with Joseph's death. They believed that maybe she was trying to kill him based on the statements that they had heard from their brother Joseph and their son Joseph when he was still alive. Does that testimony maybe rebut that possible suicide mention that the defense attorney brought up today?
It does a little bit. I think the jury will take that in consideration, but the most important thing you said is may. No one really knows, okay? It's the decedent saying this happened. There's no exact evidence of it, and they're just kind of, in my mind, speculating as to what happened. Obviously, they don't like the defendant. They're trying to put the defendant in prison. They're testifying against the defendant, so they're going to be biased. So I would bring out in closing argument, part of what I would say was, they keep saying it may be, but there's nothing to prove that it was or it wasn't. And we get right back to the definition of reasonable doubt and a not guilty. So I think that's kind of speculation, in my opinion.
Okay. Switching gears just a little bit, because I want to ask you, you've been in courtrooms before, you've been in these big trials, the 911 calls. First of all, are those usually played in a high-profile criminal trial like this?
Yeah, absolutely. And typically they're pretty dramatic. They're stuff that jurors want to hear because it's the person's voice and the emotion and whatever at the time it happened or shortly after. So I think jurors put a lot of trust into those statements.
Yeah, well, we did hear the 911 call in this case today. Again, there's some argument that prosecutors say that, Sarah Hartsfield may have delayed calling 911 for at least an hour after finding Joseph unresponsive. Her defense says that, she was on her own pain regimen and recovering at that point, like we've mentioned. But in that 911 call, I did want to mention that we could hear Sarah tell the dispatcher that she could not get her husband to wake up, that he was breathing really heavy, and that it's like he was not there. Really, she was pretty direct and to the point when she was talking with that dispatcher. But then the dispatcher said, "And who are you? What's your name, ma'am?" And that's when we started to hear some of the emotion. It appeared that at that point she might have started crying on the other end of the line. And she said, "I'm Sarah." How much does someone's demeanor matter in one of those 911 calls? And how much does the jury really listen and take that into account?
So I think in the courtroom it matters because the prosecution is going to say, for example, that early on in the call she showed no emotion, she's cold-blooded, and then she realized what she did and she got emotion. I think in real life it's very difficult to tell how someone's going to react in a certain situation. I think we expect people to be hysterical and emotional and crying and screaming on the phone on a 911 call, but until you're in that situation, until you're on the phone calling, you don't know how you're going to react. And we try to get that across to juries because there's always going to be the argument that there's emotion or there's no emotion on one side and the same on the other. But a determination has to be made of the person's personality. What are they like? What is their demeanor? So I think overall it does affect juries because the prosecutors typically point it out and people expect you to have emotion because they've never really been in that situation before. And it's what they see on TV and in movies.
Right. Yeah, kind of that little true crime feeling to it when you actually get to hear the 911 call you want to hear in that moment. And I should mention, just in listening to it, there's a little bit of background noise going on and things. It's, I think recorded in the dispatch center and you can hear kind of some other things. And so to get a, exactly clear picture of exactly what her voice sounded like, I don't know that you could say for sure, just because of some of the other noises that we were hearing. We did not see her arrive with the Bible to court this morning, by the way. I know we talked about that yesterday, but it did appear that she had the Bible sitting on the table in front of her during everything. I wanted to ask you about something else because we did see her. We've seen her several days now, really intently taking notes at certain points based on some of the testimony that she's heard. And she seems to be really actively involved where she'll be leaning over and whispering to one of the defense attorneys or the investigator and, her team, whispering certain things to them or maybe suggesting that they ask the witness on the stand something that she thinks needs to be asked. I personally know that she's had a lot to say about what happened and what didn't happen with some of those messages that she sent from jail. Based on kind of what we've seen so far and based on kind of what we know about her ability or I guess need to communicate, what do you think that says about the possibility of her testifying?
So the first thing the public needs to understand is it's her decision. It's the client's decision whether or not to testify. As a lawyer, we can give strong advice to or to not testify, but at the end of the day, they make that decision and, if they decide to testify, we go forward. Based on everything you've said so far and everything I've seen, I believe she wants to testify. Will her lawyer be able to talk her out of that? I don't know. But when you put the defendant on the stand, the whole focus of the trial changes. It's directly on, the focus is on her, on the defendant. And if the jury believes she's being deceptive about anything, it's over. All the hard work you've got up to that point, everything you've done as cross-examination, all the evidence you put on, if the jury does not believe her, it could be a minor point, it could be something that's not really related to the case, but in my opinion, if they believe she's being deceptive, case is over, they're gonna find her guilty. So it's risky, but it's the client's decision to do it. I think you're right, she probably wants to testify, we'll see if she does.
If you were her lawyer at this point, Rick, what would you tell her the best reason would be to testify and maybe the worst reason? I know you said that it could put all that hard work aside, but I'm just curious, like maybe she thinks she has something that the jury really needs to hear from her, that she can convince them of something.
So based on her previous statements and what I know about this case, I would strongly advise her not to testify. And I would tell her there is no good reason for you to testify. I think it would be, in this case, a disaster. It would just be a very brutal cross-examination. I think the prosecutors have enough information to keep her up there for hours and pick at her. So my advice would be not to testify. And part of that is there's a huge hole in the case. If I was doing closing argument in this case, I would hold up the indictment and I'd call it a donut. There's a big hole in it. So you don't need to testify. The state hasn't proven their case. They can't prove their case. They haven't carried the burden, so why risk it? Let's go forward and ask for a not guilty.
One last thing I want to ask you, because this was not in our talks ahead of time, but I'm curious because throughout this case, we obviously did the documentary, The Two Sides of Sarah. That was before this trial even started, and we traveled around and we spoke with some of her, the people from her past, some of the exes, her foster mother, one of her children. And those are some of the people who are actually on the witness list, and they are expected to testify here at some point during the trial. What they'll be able to say, we still don't know. You know, they expressed when we interviewed them and when we talked with them that they felt that there were so many things over the years that she has been able to get away with or talk her way out of that they just don't feel like she has ever been held accountable. And the fact that all of them are on this witness list and showing up here, some of them from out of town, many of them actually from out of town, it's almost like they feel like this might be their opportunity for justice as well. Like, understandably, this is Joseph Hartsfield's trial, or it's related to Joseph Hartsfield's death. It's a trial for that. But some of them, I don't know, they might just feel the sense that they need justice as well. I don't know. As a defense attorney, I know that might be a hard thing to think about, but I've heard from these people. I've talked with them personally, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I get it, but from a legal standpoint, as a lawyer and a defense lawyer defending a client such as this, the first question is some of those are extraneous offense testimony. So is the judge going to allow that in? I don't think it should come in, but obviously it's not my decision, but the defense lawyer has to zealously argue to keep that stuff out. Also, some of the other evidence you've talked about is character evidence, and character evidence that the person acted within that character. I don't think that comes in either unless she testifies. So for some of those witnesses to come in and say she's a bad person, she cheats on her taxes, whatever, I don't think any of that is relevant in this case until either the defense opens the door or she testifies in terms of character evidence. The extraneous offense stuff, again, it's going to be up to the judge and there's going to be arguments on both sides, but all that matters is what the jury hears in the courtroom. I understand your position, I understand you talk to them, but that's what the rules of evidence are for, to decide what the jury hears and make a decision solely on that.
Yeah, no, and that's really not my position, just to be clear. I mean, it's just I've heard that from them, and I feel like hearing that, it's just a question that comes to mind. You know, we talked with them, we spent hours with them when we went and interviewed them, and so I was just curious about that. I see a note that we had a couple other questions on the YouTube Live asking, do we know what prescription drugs were detected in Joseph's system? So the testimony that we have heard about the drugs so far is that they were some sort of benzodiazepine. We don't know exactly which one. That hasn't really been revealed. We know that Sarah had been prescribed several things at the end of that surgery when she was discharged from the hospital just before all of this happened. But Joseph's family has said that he really didn't like taking any sort of medications, and they didn't know him to have a prescription for any sort of benzo. So that's really as much of the testimony as we have seen. And also another question, were there additional drugs in Joseph's system? So there has been a lot of testimony just speaking to that in addition to the insulin, there was a benzo, and even today, some questions came up about when he may have gotten that benzo. Was it from EMS when they were transporting him to the hospital for some reason? It doesn't appear that it happened at the hospital, because that nurse testified that everything would have been documented in the patient's records. So still a lot of questions there as well. Rick, is there any final thoughts that you have? I mean, it's day 3. We got through several more witnesses today. It was just 2 yesterday. I believe we had 4 today, plus wrapping up 1 from yesterday. So it's moving along. Any final thoughts?
Well, it's a very interesting case, and I'm very interested in seeing how the prosecution is going to tie this together so the jury can buy it or agree that she's a murderer. I don't see anything at this point that shows that she's culpable for him dying or that she was a caretaker. So I want to see what they're thinking and how they tie that together. Very important testimonies coming up with the medical examiner, and I think the cross-examination is going to be fierce on that.
The medical examiner for sure, and also the messages, because there's a lot of messages that we haven't seen. I know we talked about that last night, about what may be in the messages and what how that may catch someone, because you never know when those messages are going to get read. But listen, we've been outside of this courthouse since it was like dawn this morning. The sun was still coming up, and now it's gone down. So I think that's going to be all for this YouTube Live. Thank you so much for just helping us understand, again, some of these big concepts. I know a lot of people are following this case closely and wanting to know what will end up happening with it. So, Rick, thank you. And I know you're going to be gone for a couple days. We will check in with you again, and I'll keep sending you all my notes from court.
Yes, sir. Get some rest.
All right. Thank you so much. We will be back here at the Chambers County Courthouse tomorrow for day 4. We don't yet know who will be on the stand first, but based on what we saw today, it appears that maybe we will hear some additional medical testimony, also possibly from the medical examiner. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here on YouTube Live. We do want to just leave you with the final thoughts that we had leaving court earlier today, just a kind of a recap of everything that we heard from the testimony inside. Have a good rest of the night.
Well, medical records take center stage in the Sarah Hartsfield insulin murder trial in Chambers County. Prosecutors revealing her 5th husband's blood sugar level may have been dangerously low almost for an entire day before he went to the hospital. KPRC 2's Bryce Newberry has been in the courtroom all day. He's joining us live tonight. Bryce, what do doctors say that this meant for his death?
Well, Lisa, one of the doctors testified that this would have meant it was an extremely tragic death for Joseph Hartsfield. We did get to see some of the data from his glucose monitor, which revealed that his blood sugar level could have been dangerously low for about 20 hours before he was rushed to the hospital. The defense team, though, really hammered some of the same points that these medical experts made, that Joseph Hartsfield did not manage his diabetes well for years, and that could have led to some very severe complications that he would have had to deal with. And none of these experts could actually say who gave Joseph Hartsfield too much insulin. So we saw 2 of Joe's doctors on the stand. We also saw a nurse and a paramedic, all of them on the witness stand for hours today, and seemingly surprised to find out that Joseph Hartsfield would have died from letting his sugar level get too low, because one actually testified that he had an extreme fear of getting that low, and that he sometimes wouldn't even take his prescribed amount of insulin, or he'd skip it altogether. In this case, one of the doctors said it's clear. He either got a huge amount of long-acting insulin, or he repeatedly got injected with short-acting insulin. Prosecutors shared some data you can see there from his glucose monitor in the hours before his hospitalization. You can see there's some alarm bells that show up, and that's all of the alerts that would usually prompt a diabetic to do something about it, like have juice and boost their sugar level. But there are still a lot of questions about who got those alerts or how loud they may have been. In court, we did see Sarah Hartsfield's defense team poke a lot of holes in the evidence. They highlighted that Joe had complications with diabetes well before he even met Sarah, and that he didn't always follow the doctor's orders when it came to managing it. We ended the day with an ER nurse who was on the stand, and she said that when Joseph Hartsfield got admitted to the hospital, she did everything that was in protocol, and everything that they tried to do to save him didn't seem to work. It was to the point that she was even questioning if she was doing something wrong. Lisa.
And Bryce, we understand you also heard Sarah Hartsfield's phone call to 911 that was played in court today. What did she say?
So yeah, that phone call, Lisa, is kind of a key piece of this case, because prosecutors allege that Sarah delayed a phone call to 911 after she found Joseph unresponsive. But her defense team has claimed that no, actually, she was recovering from her own surgery and she was on medication at the time. So she may not have exactly said the timing right of when she called 911 after finding him unresponsive. But in that phone call, we did hear Sarah say that she couldn't get her husband to wake up. She said that he was breathing really heavy, but it was like he was not there. However, in listening to that phone call, it was not until toward the end that we actually heard some emotion, and that was when the dispatcher asked her what her name was. Lisa.
We know you're tracking every detail for us every day in Chambers County in court. Bryce Newberry live tonight for us. Thank you.